I have a message from someone close to you, and it feels deeply important. Before you continue, take a quiet moment because what you are about to hear comes from a place of distance, silence, and hidden regret. It reaches you now because something in this situation has changed. And when emotions finally rise to the surface, time begins to feel different. Hello everyone, and welcome. Please remember to subscribe, click the bell, and turn on all notifications. Every message shared here is meant to encourage you to see things from a different perspective, sometimes in ways you may not expect. Your person has been carrying something inside for a very long time, much longer than they would ever admit out loud. This did not begin recently. It has been slowly building beneath the surface, even while they acted as though everything was normal or as if nothing had changed between the two of you. They did not suddenly forget you. They did not wake up one morning and simply stop caring. What really happened is that they buried their emotions because they didn't know how to deal with them in a healthy way. When feelings are buried instead of expressed, they do not disappear. They remain alive in silence, and over time, they become heavier. What is coming through now is not a message of complete certainty or peace. It comes from emotional pressure, confusion, and inner discomfort. Your person is not fully at ease. There is a restlessness growing inside them that they can no longer ignore. Something recently awakened these feelings. It may have been a memory, a familiar name, a certain place, or simply a quiet moment when distractions were no longer strong enough to hide what they truly felt. Whatever the reason, it brought you back into their thoughts with unusual intensity. This time, the feeling did not quickly fade away. It stayed with them. It remained in their mind during quiet moments, especially late at night when everything becomes still and there is nothing left to distract the heart. During those quiet moments, they began facing an uncomfortable realization. They might actually lose you completely, not just for a little while, but in a way that may never be fully repaired. This understanding did not arrive gently. It came in waves. It appeared when they looked at their phone and realized nothing meaningful was happening. It appeared while trying to enjoy everyday life, but feeling emotionally disconnected from everything around them. It appeared when silence became louder than every conversation they had. They are finally beginning to understand something they avoided for a long time. No one else feels quite like you. No one else responds the same way. No one else creates the same emotional comfort they once quietly took for granted. That realization is not comforting anymore. It hurts. The urgency growing inside them is not only about love. It is also about fear. The fear of losing access to something they never fully appreciated while they still had it. If they could speak honestly without pride or fear getting in the way, they would admit they should have acted differently. They would admit they believed there would always be more time. They assumed your presence would remain steady, no matter how inconsistent they became. But now they understand that silence also creates distance, and distance, when left untouched long enough, can begin to feel permanent. They are also realizing another difficult truth. Doing nothing was never truly neutral. It was still a choice. And every choice carries consequences. Their silence slowly changed the emotional connection between the two of you, even though they failed to recognize it while it was happening. They regret not showing up when it truly mattered. They regret remaining silent when clarity was needed. They regret choosing avoidance when honesty would have created something much healthier. At the time, staying quiet seemed easier. It seemed safer. It gave them the illusion of control. But avoidance always asks for payment, even if that cost does not appear immediately. Your person struggles to express emotions, not because they lack deep feelings, but because they often feel too many emotions at once and do not know how to organize them. Opening their heart feels risky. It feels like giving up control or becoming emotionally exposed in ways they do not know how to handle. So instead of expressing themselves, they withdraw. Instead of communicating, they postpone. Instead of facing difficult emotions directly, they hope time will somehow solve them. But emotions that are ignored do not disappear. They collect quietly beneath the surface. There is an important psychological truth they are beginning to experience, even if they cannot explain it in those words. What we refuse to face inside ourselves eventually appears in our actions, our relationships, and the consequences we experience. Now they are beginning to feel the weight of everything left unresolved. One of the hardest parts for them is recognizing that you are no longer emotionally where you once were. They can sense the difference. Your energy has changed. Your responses no longer carry the same emotional tone. There is a quiet distance in your silence that feels heavier than any argument ever could. You may still care, but you are no longer waiting in the same way. You're no longer chasing explanations. You're no longer remaining trapped in confusion. You're no longer offering endless emotional space without receiving honesty and clarity in return. That change affects them deeply. They had become familiar with your patience. They had become comfortable with your understanding. They had grown used to your emotional availability, even during times when they were not giving the same back to you. Now that balance has changed, and they feel the absence of what they once assumed would always remain. What they fear losing is not only your presence. They fear losing the emotional safety they felt with you, the way you understood them, the way you listened without making them feel judged. They are beginning to understand that not every connection can simply be replaced. Not every emotional bond can be recreated with someone else. That realization brings both regret and fear. They find themselves asking difficult questions. Did they damage something truly meaningful? Did they take your presence for granted? Did they wait too long before making an effort? These questions return during quiet moments, especially when they compare their current experiences with the connection they once shared with you. Nothing feels quite the same anymore. This is where the urgency becomes stronger. Not because they suddenly learned how to love, but because they have finally realized that time no longer feels unlimited. They fear that if they continue waiting, the emotional door between you may quietly close forever. Not through a dramatic ending or a loud confrontation, but through a silent emotional shift where your heart simply moves on. That possibility is extremely difficult for them to accept. They want to reach out. They want to explain themselves. They want to offer an honest apology without hiding behind excuses. Yet fear continues to stop them. They fear rejection. They fear being too late. They fear that your feelings have already changed. So they hesitate. They write messages only to delete them. They imagine conversations that never actually happen. Meanwhile, the emotional weight they carry continues growing heavier. This is not a promise that everything will suddenly change. It is not a guarantee of transformation. It is simply awareness. It is the moment when someone finally sees the value of what they failed to appreciate at the right time. What matters most now is what this means for you. You're no longer standing in the emotional place where you once waited. You're no longer trapped inside the same cycle of uncertainty. Slowly but steadily, you have begun moving forward within yourself. That is why everything feels different now. They are replaying old memories through completely different eyes, not through pride anymore, but through loss. They remember your effort. They remember your patience. They remember the moments when you showed kindness, even when the same understanding was not returned equally. Now those memories carry much greater emotional weight. They are also beginning to understand something uncomfortable. You were never asking them to be perfect. You were asking them to be present. You were asking for consistency. You were asking to be met halfway emotionally. That is what they failed to give. They chose the comfort of avoidance instead of the discomfort that growth requires. They chose delay instead of honesty. And now they are living with the consequences of those choices. Meanwhile, you are no longer emotionally standing where you once were. You observe more carefully. You think more clearly. You are no longer shaped by uncertainty in the same way. That inner change creates a distance they can no longer ignore. They now find themselves standing at an emotional crossroads. One path feels familiar because it avoids vulnerability. The other path requires honesty, responsibility, and emotional openness, yet it is also the only path that might begin repairing what has been damaged. The difficulty is that taking that step means facing you, but even more importantly, facing themselves. That is the part they struggle with the most. They are beginning to understand that loss often becomes visible before it becomes final. First, it appears as a feeling. Then, it becomes awareness. Then, if nothing changes, it slowly becomes reality. Right now, they seem to be standing somewhere between awareness and fear. They can sense that you are moving forward emotionally, not because of anger, but because of clarity. And that may be what frightens them the most, because clarity is often much harder to reverse than emotion. They are not only afraid of losing you, they are afraid of realizing that they understood your value only after your heart had already begun to let go. They are also afraid of what it says about them if they lose you, that they waited too long, that they remained silent for too long, that they assumed too much without taking enough action. Now they are standing in that truth, whether they are ready to face it or not. I have a message from someone connected to your situation, and it carries something meaningful. Before you continue, slow your thoughts for a moment, because what you are about to hear comes from distance, silence, and emotions that were never fully expressed when they should have been. It is not loud, but it is heavy. It reflects a change that has been quietly building for a long time. This message is not here to control your feelings or tell you what to believe. It simply describes a shift that has already taken place beneath the surface of this connection, even if it has never been openly spoken. Your person has been carrying many things inside for a long time, not only recently, but through countless moments that seemed small at the time. Those were the moments when honesty could have appeared. Those were the moments when clarity could have been spoken. Instead, silence was chosen. And now those silent moments feel much heavier than they ever did before. It was never truly about not caring. It was about fear. Fear of opening up. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of losing control over how they were seen. So instead of speaking honestly, they stayed quiet. Instead of facing difficult emotions directly, they postponed them. But time has a way of collecting everything we avoid. Now those unspoken moments no longer feel small. They feel enormous inside their mind because they can finally see how every one of them slowly added distance between the two of you. They remember that you did not suddenly leave. You did not make one dramatic decision and disappear emotionally. Instead, you slowly adjusted. You adapted to what was being given. You stopped filling emotional spaces they refused to fill themselves. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped giving more than you were receiving. Without announcing it, you quietly began protecting your own peace. That change was never loud. It was quiet, steady, and intentional. That is exactly what they are noticing now. They can feel that you no longer lean toward them in the same way. You no longer fight so hard to be understood. You no longer push for answers with the same emotional intensity. Instead, there is a calmness within you now, a grounded confidence. That calmness unsettles them more than anything else, because calmness does not resemble confusion. Calmness resembles clarity. And clarity usually means important decisions have already been made within the heart. They are beginning to understand that they can no longer depend on your uncertainty to keep this connection alive. You are no longer waiting inside confusion. You are standing inside self-respect. That changes everything about the relationship between you. They are also afraid to reach out because they know they are not fully ready to show up differently. They may want to tell you they cared. They may want to explain everything they were feeling. But deep down, they understand that words alone cannot repair what repeated behavior damaged. That is where they feel trapped. They are caught between two different versions of themselves, One part wants to stay hidden because hiding still feels safe. The other part wants to grow. But growth always asks for discomfort. It asks for honesty. It asks for responsibility. Right now, they are sitting inside that discomfort without fully knowing how to move through it. There's another painful realization beginning to appear. You were never just someone they loved. You were also a reflection of the person they could have become emotionally. Instead of growing toward that reflection, they turned away from it. Now, that reflection feels like something they have lost. They are beginning to understand that delayed growth never disappears. It simply becomes heavier when it finally arrives. That is the weight they are carrying now. At the same time, they are noticing something important about you. You did not fall apart in the way they expected. You did not remain trapped in the same emotional place. You adapted. You healed in your own way. You quietly chose yourself in ways they did not notice at first. But now, they cannot ignore. That is why everything feels different whenever they think about you. The version of you they once knew is no longer the complete picture. They can clearly see that you are no longer emotionally available in the same way. You are no longer easily reached through confusion or inconsistency. You have become more grounded, more aware, more certain of your own worth. That is something they never expected. They are also realizing they cannot return to your life carrying the same energy they left with. Half-hearted effort no longer belongs in the person you have become. Emotional inconsistency no longer matches the standards you now live by. They can feel that difference very clearly. That creates a deep conflict within them. They do not want to return unchanged, but they still do not fully know how to become the person they need to be. They are living in a place of awareness without meaningful action. That place feels uncomfortable every single day. They are also beginning to see you differently, not simply as someone they once had, but as someone who has grown beyond the version of the relationship they emotionally abandoned. That realization creates both admiration and regret. They understand now that you were never asking for too much. You were asking for emotional presence. You were asking for consistency. You were asking for honesty. Those were never unreasonable expectations. They were simply the foundation of a healthy relationship. At that time, however, they were unable to meet those needs consistently. So instead of stepping forward, they stepped away. Now they understand that stepping away carried consequences. Not immediate consequences. Emotional consequences. Consequences that quietly accumulated over time. Today, those consequences are visible in the distance between the two of you. You are no longer emotionally available in the same way. You are no longer waiting with endless patience. You are no longer offering unlimited access to your heart without honesty in return. That shift has completely changed the structure of this connection. They can feel that you no longer stand in the same emotional place. You observe more, you react less, you think more clearly. That clarity is something they can no longer easily influence. That is why their emotional world feels unstable. They are responding to someone who no longer lives from confusion or emotional dependence. You now move from awareness, and awareness changes everything. They are also facing something they avoided for a very long time: accountability, not only for what they said, but for everything they never said. Not only for the actions they took, but also for the actions they repeatedly avoided. Avoidance always creates a cost. Eventually, that cost becomes impossible to ignore. Now, they are sitting with that reality. Meanwhile, you're no longer trying to rescue someone else's emotional state. You have entered a place where your own peace matters more than emotional uncertainty. That is not coldness. That is clarity. And clarity transforms the way relationships work. They are beginning to understand they cannot expect emotional access to you while remaining the same person. Emotional access requires emotional responsibility. That responsibility was missing before. Now, they are finally feeling the distance it created. They also recognize something difficult. The version of you who accepted confusion, inconsistency, and emotional uncertainty no longer exists in the same way. That version has changed through experience, through reflection, through emotional growth. That change cannot simply be undone to make someone else feel comfortable again. They are now facing the possibility that what they once took for granted may no longer be available in the same form. That realization brings both fear and deep reflection. They are grieving more than the relationship. They are grieving the version of you who stayed longer, who tried harder, who tolerated more than was healthy. That version of you is no longer here. Now, all they are left with is awareness. And awareness without action slowly becomes emotional pressure. They are beginning to understand that love cannot survive on good intentions alone. It requires consistent effort, emotional presence, responsibility. Without those things, connection slowly fades into distance. That is what happened here. You did not suddenly disappear. You evolved. You learned through experience. You built healthier boundaries. You stopped abandoning yourself for someone else's uncertainty. That is why you feel different today. That is why you respond differently today. That is why they notice the change so strongly. They now stand in a place where they can clearly see everything they failed to see before. But seeing is not the same as changing. That is where they remain. They are aware, but not yet fully transformed. They are emotional, but not yet fully prepared. They are reflective, but not yet consistently different. That gap continues to keep them from acting with stability. Meanwhile, you are no longer waiting inside that gap. You have already stepped beyond it. You are building a life that no longer depends on emotional uncertainty. You're moving forward with greater clarity than before. That is what makes this situation impossible to return to in its old form. Once someone stops waiting in confusion and begins living with clarity, the relationship can never go back to what it once was. They are learning that lesson now, in real time. As they process everything, they are beginning to accept something they spent a long time avoiding. You were never temporary. You were never as replaceable as they once believed. You were genuinely meaningful. That meaning does not disappear simply because it was not cared for properly. But meaning by itself is not enough to rebuild what consistency failed to protect. Now they are left with reflection, regret, and growing awareness. You are left with growth, clarity, and direction. Between those two places, the distance becomes impossible to ignore. You are no longer living in the waiting season of your life. You are building something new. That is why this message is not meant to pull you backward. It is simply confirming the change that has already happened inside you. You are no longer the person who waited inside uncertainty. You are the person who learned from it. That changes everything moving forward. Trust is like a living thing. It needs a safe environment to survive and grow. That environment slowly disappeared when they stopped helping you build it. As time passed, that lack of effort became clearer to both of you. What once felt uncertain has now become much more defined. The distance between you was not created in one dramatic moment. It formed little by little through repeated silence, hesitation, and emotional inconsistency. As they look back from a distance, they are beginning to understand something they failed to recognize before. The greatest form of strength was never holding someone emotionally while waiting for them to change. It was having enough courage to walk away when that emotional space was no longer respected or protected. Because of that realization, they now see you differently. You are no longer the person who waits inside confusion or keeps filling emotional gaps just to keep the relationship alive. You became the person who recognized something was no longer being cared for properly and finally chose yourself. That transformation did not happen loudly. It happened quietly through small decisions that protected your peace. That is what they are now trying to understand. They remain caught inside endless what-if questions, replaying moments when they could have been more honest, more present, or more emotionally available. Those memories now feel much heavier because they are no longer simply memories. They have become visible consequences. They are beginning to understand that the silence between you is no longer just a pause. It has become a reflection. It reflects every time they stepped back, every moment they avoided honesty, every occasion they assumed things would stay the same without real effort. For a long time, they believed they could simply return whenever they wanted. They assumed emotional access would always remain open. Now, they see something very different. You did not simply create stronger boundaries. You transformed your entire emotional world. It is no longer the place they once left behind. That realization creates deep discomfort because they understand they are not simply late. They have become distant. They are also beginning to respect your strength in ways they never truly appreciated before. They now see how you handled inconsistency without becoming bitter, without lowering your emotional standards, without losing yourself. That was never weakness. It was emotional maturity. Now they clearly feel the difference between what you consistently offered and what they consistently gave. The urgency they're experiencing comes from something even deeper. They fear you are no longer emotionally available in the same way, not because you are angry, because you are peaceful. That peace is far more powerful than emotional reactions. Peace often means closure has already begun forming inside, even without spoken words. They are beginning to realize that your emotional stability no longer depends on them. That is perhaps the hardest truth for them to accept. When someone realizes they are no longer necessary for another person's emotional balance, their place in the story changes completely. They are no longer the center of your emotional world. Slowly, they are becoming part of your memories instead. That change is difficult for them to process. They are also facing another uncomfortable truth. They can no longer place the blame on circumstances, not on timing, not on distance, not on outside situations. They are being drawn into a more honest reflection. They were not emotionally present in the way you needed when it mattered most. That realization is painful, but it can no longer be avoided. They are finally understanding that you were never asking for anything unreasonable. You wanted consistency. You wanted emotional presence. You wanted honesty. You wanted respect for the emotional effort you continually invested. These were never impossible expectations. They were simply the foundation of a healthy relationship. At the time, however, they could not consistently meet those needs. Now the absence of that effort has created a distance neither of you can ignore. As they sit with these realizations, another change is taking place inside them. They are no longer simply remembering you. They are comparing the person they used to be with the person they are slowly becoming. That comparison is uncomfortable. It exposes the gap between intention and action. They are also beginning to see you differently, not as someone waiting, not as someone lost in confusion, but as someone who has grown beyond the emotional pattern they once shared. You no longer respond from the same emotional place. You observe more carefully, you understand more deeply, you continue moving forward. That changes everything. Because now they recognize they cannot return to the same relationship they left behind. That version no longer exists. The emotional access they once assumed would always be there is no longer automatic. It would have to be earned again. Not through beautiful words, not through promises, through consistent action, through honesty, through real change. That is exactly where they feel stuck. They want connection, but they now understand that connection always requires responsibility. Responsibility was something they avoided before. Now they are carrying the emotional weight of that avoidance. Meanwhile, you are no longer making decisions from emotional dependence. You're no longer shaping your future around uncertainty. You're no longer waiting for clarity from someone who repeatedly struggled to offer it. Instead, you have created clarity within yourself. That is why everything feels different now.